I'm so used to talking about topics that are having to do with space and microspace that I thought I had to start off this talk by saying that the entrepreneurial experience is not specific to one particular field. And instead of the title page that I created, I was actually thinking of calling this 1 part per billion, because what you realize, start a small company, you're not the only one in the world who's been doing that. So, but it is a little bit unusual in the space business to start a satellite company and to succeed with it. And in the way of talking about another aspect of the experience other than just the small satellites, talk a little bit about the history of the company. It's a little bit talking about the past, because we're going back a long, long way to a company that was started in 1988 and was sold in 2008. So we're talking a little bit of history, but I think the experience is fairly common, whether it's back then or now. The company was nominally started in 1988, though the motivation for starting the company came a long time before that, and that is a little bit of a story of microsatellites. I had started working in the aerospace industry around 1980, 1981, and some years before that, maybe 5 years before that, started working with AMSAT, the Amateur Radio Satellite Organization, building little satellites with other ham radio people, of which I was one. And the contrast between working at Jet Propulsion Lab or working at a major space contractor, where the cost structure was such that a satellite mission in those days costed $250 million, $500 million, even more than $1 billion. And the mentality that for less than that amount of money you couldn't do anything useful, and yet working at, it was for fun, not really working, playing and volunteering with AMSAT and building satellites that we were building for a few $100s or a few $1,000s, and to us $10,000 was an unimaginably large amount of money, and during the day $10,000 was an unimaginably small amount of money to do anything. And it was that contrast that led me to pushing the idea of using small satellites for more than just a hobby, for more than just a toy, using them for something useful. And the thing that was peculiar about that, every place I worked, I went there thinking I was going to encourage this big organization to get as excited about small satellites as I was. First, at the Jet Propulsion Lab, and then at TRW, which is now a part of Northrop Grumman. And each time that I was hired, people were, we're very interested in small satellites, and we want to help you to make that happen here. And after several years, nothing was happening for various reasons that I now understand much bigger, one of them being that there were almost no contracts in small satellites. And the value of those contracts when they did exist wasn't enough to keep the Jet Propulsion Lab running for an hour in the morning. So what was the point of them doing that kind of work, really? And for a company even worse, where the bottom line was very important. And after working at 3 different places and spending about 8 years of my life trying to get a big company to get excited about small satellites and to realize what in my mind was kind of obvious, that this was the future, the next phase in space, I finally realized that if I really believed in this, as I said I believed in it, that I had to do it myself, that I couldn't expect an employer to take all the risk and to do all the pioneering work. And that was the trigger about 1987 to start the company. And then after about a year, I actually left my job, which is the other ingredient that you quite often see with people who have a very strong belief in their art, in their science, in their engineering, in their product, whatever it is. Sooner or later, they decide, look, if I'm really going to do this, I have to commit all of my energy to it. And I wasn't that smart back then, but for whatever reason, probably having to do more with the fact that I was very frustrated, I just thought, I'm just dropping what I've been doing in the rest of my life, and I'm doing this. And it meant, as you often hear these stories, living without a salary and stopping to go to an office and creating a little office at my house. And it's not that most pleasant existence, other than the fact that it was kind of nice to have a break from going to the office every day. So the basic story of the company was that we started off at that point, and with just me as the employee. When the company was sold in 2008, we had 85 formal full-time employees, but a total headcount, including full-time consultants, including interns, including other sorts of people who work at the company who don't count as full-time employees. We had about 110 people coming to the office every day, and sales $19-20 million a year. So it had become completely a different story than we were back in 1988 when there was nothing, or in 1989 we had small contracts for $10,000, $20,000. And I say we because, in fact, when you do that, you'll find that there are a few other people who share your dream. And we had 2 other people who came to work without salary on the promise that if we started to win contracts and we could pay them, I could pay them, we would actually, start making payments as salary, and we did that. We had offices in 3 different cities in the United States, and we had flown a number of satellites, and we also pioneered a emergency communication system now known as SPOT, which is available around the world for campers and hikers and boaters and things like that. It's sponsored by Globalstar. So the 1 part in a billion message, I think it's just humbling, and it's also reassuring to realize that every day you come in contact with, to me it was a huge step. I mean, aerospace people were used to working in huge organizations, and the idea of just going out on your own when you're 30 years old and thinking you're going to make it, when you open your eyes to entrepreneurialism, you realize that it's really a dominant lifestyle choice. I mean, when you call a plumber, when a carpenter comes to your house, or an electrician to do something, that person is an entrepreneur generally. Some of them work for big companies, but mostly not. And of course, the barbershop, hairdresser, nail center, tanning, restaurants, many of these things, when you go to have your car fixed in a garage, many of these people are small business people, and they struck out on their own. And it gives me a little bit of confidence that, look, if this guy who fixes my car can start a company, there must be some way that I can figure out to survive running this little company. Taxi drivers, and also in the professional side, I mean, there are freelance journalists, there's people who write, and they survive on getting one contract after another to write an article, to write a book, to do translation or whatever. And actually what I do now, which is sort of being a visiting professor and traveling around, is a form of entrepreneurial. So it's around. It's not, as they would say, not rocket scientist. It's something that you can do. And as far as my own background, because I didn't do that, though my father was an entrepreneur, I had no experience other than his in starting a little company. So other than I had an interest in business and so on. So I feel like if you have the motivation, it's something that you can learn. I don't feel like you just do it and all that business stuff is unimportant. I really became a fan of the business literature, read the Harvard Business Review every month. My wife was an MBA, and I borrowed a bunch of the books that she had learned, and a lot of them I found totally boring, but I did try to read as much as I could and tried to not be just a technical geek who had no knowledge of what I was up against financially or to run a company. So, I added to my preparation a little bit of background. It was just my nature as an engineer. I think every time we get into something, we want to, okay, what's this all about? I can read up on it, I can learn it. It wasn't a totally seat of the pants operation. And the company, which I kind of described, I mean, we basically started off to build little satellites and to prove that a satellite built for $100,000 or $1 million or $2 million that had a weight of a mass of 1 kilogram, 2 kilograms, up to maybe 50 kilograms for the bus was about as big as we got, and 100 kilograms for a totally integrated satellite with payload and all, was not a toy and would actually do something useful. And beyond doing something useful, would do things that you couldn't do with a big platform. And now it's 2015, late 2015, making this recording. We almost take that for granted, that if we want to have a system that does imagery of the whole Earth all the time, you need 100 satellites. 100 satellites that weigh several tons each with a cost of hundreds of millions of dollars is not feasible. So the way we do that is with satellites that cost much, much less, and maybe a 1 or 2 or 3 U cube or a little bit bigger than that. But using that size, we can proliferate satellites and overcome a lot of the limitations of orbital mechanics, do various kinds of remote sensing that way. And people now talking about internet delivery at high speed to everyone and bypassing the wired network entirely, also looking at hundreds to thousands of satellites. So that would be one application, but other applications, of course, the most obvious and the one I work in is teaching. If you want to teach people how to build satellites, you're not going to start off with $1 trillion satellite. You're going to start off with a little tiny satellite you can hold in your hand. The students can build in a semester or in a year. So there are applications for small satellites, not just trying to copy what big satellites do, but doing other things. My current interest is in illumination, which is a fairly trivial thing to talk about. Everybody understands what turning a light on is. And we live in a world where illumination of large areas, illumination of the ocean, illumination of any remote area at night is pretty much impossible. And with a sufficient number of small satellites, you can provide nearly continuous or continuous illumination. So if there would be a train wreck or a car crash in the countryside, or more importantly, let's say a problem with a ship at sea, instead of waiting for the morning for search and rescue, you could illuminate the area during the nighttime. And that requires a large number of small satellites. There's no way to do that mission with large satellites. To build a small satellite, it isn't good enough to have the design. You have to have also the components. And the components have to be small enough, low enough in power, light enough, and overall low enough in cost that you can bid a satellite for a couple of $100,000 and not have to buy a radio that at that time, space qualified S-band radio was $750,000. So that was obviously not in the cards for us. And not only was it impossible for us, but the power budget was impossible and the size was bigger than the entire satellite. So we built our own radios, we built our own sun sensors, we built our own torque coils. We basically became a subsystems company, and later on in our lives realized that that wasn't a problem, that was an advantage, that we could have more than one product line. This seems so obvious, but at the time we were so focused on building little satellites that the idea of distracting ourselves to sell radios to other people who wanted to build small satellites took years for us to discover that idea. But it also took years because there were no other builders of small satellites at the time, so there was nobody to sell them to. But anyway, that was part of our growing up as a company, was to not be quite so rigid about the fact that we are only in small satellites. And why were we rigid like that? Because I had a belief that if we tried to be many, many personalities to many, many customers, it would not be credible. We were a group at first of 9 people when we built our first satellite. We grew to 13. And it's not credible that these people can do everything. So my idea was, we're going to be the best at this. We're going to be the world famous people who really know how to build small satellites. And we're not going to do study contracts. We're not going to investigate launch vehicles. We're not going to get into components. We're going to focus on small satellites. And it was almost that I was forced to do that. When I was building large satellites, which I did do for, building, speaking of 1 part per billion, I was on a program where I was 1 part in 10,000. The workforce, the mailing list was 10,000 people. And what frustrated me, there were so many things that frustrated me. One was the amount of money spent was just astronomical to me. And I couldn't understand, okay, there are a few customers who can spend $1 billion on a satellite, but think how many more customers there are who could spend $1 million or who could spend 10,000. And we're just ignoring all of those customers. You might think of them as the tails of the industry. There are 2 or 3 customers in the United States, all government, who can afford that much money. And then when you go down a tier to geosynchronous comsats, there might be 6 customers. And that's it. The idea that all the satellite customers in the United States would boil down to 6 or 8 or 10 organizations to me seemed totally ridiculous. And I thought, well, there's probably millions of other people, or at least thousands of organizations of people who would have use for these things. But when you're working in a program that big, the innovation is very, very difficult, because the risk of having a failure in $1 billion mission is so great that when you want to try something new, you want to try something different, a different configuration, a different component, it takes years and usually decades for an innovation like that to finally find its way. So the pace of innovation, I went into aerospace thinking it would be very innovative, and I, after a few years, became disillusioned, because what I realized was we were pretty much flying only things that had flown before. And another element that bothered me about it was that nobody was looking at anything different. All of the contractors competed for all of the same identical systems jobs, and nobody was looking at what I call the blue ocean, where there are no people and there are no customers and there are no suppliers. And that's the one thing about innovating that comes to you right away. When you're the first person to make something, you're the first person to suggest something, the advantage is there's no competition. There were no small satellite builders, at least in America at that time. There were also no small satellite customers in America at that time. So it was a mixed blessing. The job then of the entrepreneur is partly to be proselytized, was the word that I used, or an educator. And I spent a lot of actually started before I started the company. I was running around the country talking about small satellites and how we could use them, but it was all theoretically because I wasn't building any other than in AMSAT. And that was too easy to dismiss and just say they were toys for amateurs to play with, but there was no practical use for them. But then, as I started the company, it became imperative to do that. I had to go and give talks and show people what this technology was and what you could do with it and what the advantages were and what types of new missions it would open up. And I did that. I spent those early years, I mean, for at least 10 years, anytime I could get an opportunity to talk about small satellites, I was out there, right, doing it, writing articles, wrote 2 books on the subject, and got the idea in the air. And sure enough, every so often, I'd give a talk and someone would walk up to me later and say, Rick, we'd like to talk to you about this idea that we have that maybe you could do with small satellites. So the blue ocean is a nice place to be, except there's nobody out there, and you've got to create demand. And that's valid. That's a valid thing to do. If you're responding to a gigantic market, there's already plenty of people out there. They don't need you as an innovator. The way I thought one of the things that's really disappointing when people talk about entrepreneurial experience, it's not like physics where there's one principle and you learn that and 4 laws of thermodynamics. Everybody's got laundry list after laundry list of pointers they can give you. And I listen to these talks on entrepreneurialism, leaves me with nothing because I can't remember all that. I can't remember all those points. So what I did instead for this talk was I tried to reduce the experience down to 5 or 6 myths that people had told me about being an entrepreneur that I found to be totally false. And in that sense, to sort of relieve you, if you're thinking about doing an entrepreneurial, innovative startup, of a lot of burden of stuff that people tell you that just gets in your way and inhibits you. And remember, when you decide to innovate and you decide to start a new company, there's going to be plenty of people giving you the caution signs of all the things. And it's true. You can really, you want to protect yourself in as many ways as possible because it might fail and you don't want to, have the burden of that failure with you for the rest of your life. So, at least from a financial point of view, I think from a personal point of view, from a psychological point of view, there's only 2 ways to not fail. And of course, the main one that most people try is to not try in the first place. So you have to give yourself credit for trying even if you fail, but on the other hand, the idea is not to fail and actually to succeed.